I never imagined my life would take such a bizarre and painful turn. If someone had told me a year ago that my father would marry my ex-wife, I would have laughed at the absurdity of it. Yet here I am, caught in the kind of twisted reality that feels like a cruel joke. It all began 5 years ago when I met the woman who would eventually become both my ex-wife and my father's wife. She was ambitious, confident, and full of grand dreams. Her charm was undeniable, so much so that I fell for her almost instantly. Our whirlwind romance led to marriage, and for a brief moment, I believed we had something real. But the illusion shattered quickly. Beneath her magnetic personality lurked a manipulative nature. She had a way of spinning words so masterfully that she could convince anyone to do her bidding. At first, I thought I was simply supporting her ambitions, funding projects she assured me would bring success. But those investments led nowhere, disappearing into thin air like smoke. Our home, once a place of love, became a battlefield of arguments over hidden credit card debt and reckless spending. For 3 exhausting years, I tried to hold on, but in the end, I had no choice but to walk away. The divorce left me heartbroken and financially drained. I had lost more than just money. I had lost my peace, my trust, and a part of myself. My father, ever the reassuring figure, comforted me, promising that time would heal my wounds. I thought he had disliked her from the beginning, disapproved of the chaos she brought into my life. So when I heard whispers that he was getting close to her, I laughed. The idea was preposterous. My father, a man in his early 50s, was stable and level-headed. My ex, still in her late 20s, had just left my life in ruins. It didn't make sense. Then one day, fate slapped me in the face. I ran into them at a cafe. The way they startled at the sight of me, the awkward way my father introduced her as though we were strangers, it was a moment that sent my world spinning. That night, I confronted him, demanding answers. He insisted they were simply 2 people finding solace in each other's company after heartbreak. My ex, with her usual nonchalance, told me it was none of my business. I was furious. It felt like the ultimate betrayal, but my father dismissed my anger. He was an adult, he said. His choices were his own. I hoped naively that whatever they had would fizzle out quickly. But just a few months later, an invitation arrived. A wedding. My father was marrying my ex-wife. I called him in disbelief, half expecting him to admit it was a joke. Instead, he spoke of love, of fate, of how they had found something special. He even had the audacity to expect my blessing. My ex sent me a text saying they hoped I would be happy for them. The nerve of it all left me reeling. I refused to attend. But they went through with it anyway, a small ceremony attended by my father's friends. Photos flooded social media. My father beaming in a sharp new suit, my ex radiant in a sparkling wedding gown. The comments ranged from polite confusion to outright disbelief. Some whispered about the strangeness of it all, but my father either didn't care or refused to acknowledge it. I distanced myself. If this was the path he had chosen, then he could walk it without me. For months, he gushed about her talents, how she was a brilliant entrepreneur leading him toward financial success. I clenched my teeth, remembering how that same brilliance had cost me so much. But he was convinced, blinded by love, or perhaps by the illusion she wove so well. Then, things took a familiar turn. The house he had lived in for years was transformed. Extravagant furniture, high-end gadgets, luxury decor, things my father had never cared for before suddenly became part of his everyday life. She posted pictures online, flaunting their lavish new lifestyle. A sinking feeling took root in my chest. I had seen this pattern before. I told myself he was an adult, that he could handle his own finances, that it was no longer my problem. Until one day, my phone rang. My father's voice was heavy with exhaustion. He asked to meet. Urgently. When I arrived at the cafe, the man sitting before me was not the confident, self-assured father I had known. He looked worn out, his face lined with stress, his shirt wrinkled. The weight of something unbearable pressed down on him. And then, he confessed. The same father who once scolded me for letting my ex manipulate me now admitted that she had convinced him to invest tens of thousands, perhaps even more, into a so-called luxury goods business. A business that had now crumbled into nothing. The money was gone. At first, she had reassured him, just as she once reassured me. Delays in paperwork, technical issues, promises of massive returns. But now, as the numbers failed to add up and the excuses wore thin, he realized the truth. He was trapped. And now, he was looking to me, the son he had once dismissed, for help. I sat across from my father, watching the weight of his mistakes settle into the lines of his tired face. He was desperate, pleading, his voice thick with regret. Just a year ago, he had married the woman who had once been my wife, the same woman who had left me heartbroken and financially drained. Now, he was sitting before me, broken in a way I had never seen, begging for my help. She had done to him exactly what she had done to me. Only this time, the consequences were even worse. It had all started with promises. She convinced him that she had connections, that she could double his investments with her business acumen. Little by little, she gained control over his finances, and before he knew it, she was managing his retirement funds. My father, blinded by love, ignored every red flag, believing she was securing their future together. But now, his accounts were drained, and the life he had built for himself was crumbling. She had taken everything. His house, the home he had cherished for years, was on the verge of foreclosure. Loans were piling up, the interest swallowing him whole. Whenever he asked her about the money, she brushed him off with empty reassurances, making excuses about delays and setbacks. It was only when he realized there was nothing left that the truth became unavoidable. She had scammed him. And now, in his desperation, he had turned to me. I stared at him, struggling to suppress the mix of emotions rising inside me. The irony was almost laughable. He had ignored my warnings, dismissed my pain, and even married the woman who had betrayed me. And now, he was asking for my savings to fix his mistakes. His voice was strained, his hands trembling as he reached for me. "You're my son," he pleaded. "You can't let me lose everything." Anger burned in my chest. Where was this concern when I was the one drowning in debt because of her? Where was his sympathy when I told him she was dangerous? He had never once apologized for what he had done, never acknowledged the humiliation, the pain he had put me through. And now he expected me to bail him out? I took a deep breath and met his gaze. "She scammed you," I said coldly. "Just like she scammed me." He lowered his head, shame flickering in his eyes, but then his tone shifted. "This is family," he insisted. "You can't just turn your back on me." I could hear the desperation in his voice, the veiled attempt at guilt tripping me, but I refused to let it work. "I'll think about it," I muttered, knowing full well that I wouldn't give him a single cent. As I stood to leave, he called after me, reminding me that time was running out. The bank was ready to seize his home. But I simply walked away, my mind made up. A few days later, the calls became frantic. His voice was nearly unrecognizable, thick with panic. The situation had worsened. Hidden charges had appeared on his credit cards, designer clothes, jewelry, extravagant gifts. Thousands of dollars spent without his knowledge, all leading back to her. She was nowhere to be found. When he confronted her, she had barely reacted. He told me she had simply grabbed her bag and walked out, saying she needed space. The same excuse she had given me before she disappeared from my life. He admitted, with a voice laced in pain, that she might have been cheating on him. The late nights, the sudden disappearances, it had all been happening under his nose, just as it had with me. Now, standing in the ruins of what he once thought was love, he was finally seeing her for what she was. He called me again, asking me to come over. I arrived to find him drowning in paperwork, his hands shaking as he sorted through the bills. His home, once a place of comfort, now felt like a war zone. The woman he had loved, had trusted, had methodically drained every cent, even transferring large sums from his retirement accounts into offshore holdings under the pretense of high-return investments. Now, there was nothing left. He begged me to track her down, to talk sense into her, as if I had ever had that kind of power over her. I let out a bitter laugh at the thought. She had never listened to me. She had never cared about my words. What made him think she would listen now? "If we can't find her, I'll lose everything," he choked out. "She has the account information. I don't know how to fix this." I sighed, looking at the man who had once been my role model, the man who had dismissed my suffering only to now find himself trapped in the same nightmare. He had been so sure that he knew better. Now, his arrogance had cost him everything. For the first time since this all began, he finally admitted it. Tears welled in his eyes as he whispered the words I never thought I'd hear. I was wrong. I should have believed you. I should have listened. His voice cracked, heavy with regret. Please help me. Part of me wanted to walk away, to let him suffer the way I had suffered. But another part of me, one I wasn't sure I liked, felt pity. He was still my father. And as much as I wanted to see him learn his lesson, I didn't want to watch him completely lose everything. I knew I wouldn't give him money, but I could try to help him in other ways. Together, we filed a police report detailing the missing funds. Legally, because they were married, the situation was complicated, but there was still a chance to hold her accountable. We consulted a financial lawyer, explaining how she had manipulated him into transferring assets without his true consent. If we could prove fraud, such as forged signatures or deceptive transactions, there might be a way to fight back. Still, my father wasn't out of danger. With the bills piling up, he quietly asked me to help cover some of his immediate debts. I didn't hesitate before saying no. I'm not paying for her spending spree, I told him firmly. He looked crushed, but I had made my decision. Then, just when he thought things couldn't get worse, he discovered that she had sold some of his most prized possessions, including his beloved vintage coin collection. She had sold them online, pocketed the money, and disappeared. She was gone. Her phone was disconnected. Her social media accounts were wiped. No one knew where she had gone, but one thing was clear, she wasn't coming back. The whispers started. Friends and neighbors, once congratulating my father on his unexpected love story, now murmured about how he had been scammed by a much younger woman. Humiliated, he began avoiding people, isolating himself in his nearly empty home, haunted by the mistakes that had led him here. And yet, even with everything crumbling around him, he still clung to one last hope. One final plea. I'm your father, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Please. I looked at him, the man who had chosen to marry my ex-wife despite every warning. The man who had dismissed my suffering until he found himself in the same position. And I asked myself, did he truly deserve saving? My father's voice was heavy with frustration, his eyes pleading as he leaned forward. I took care of you when you were growing up. You owe me. The same old guilt trip. The same tired manipulation. I stared at him, remembering how he had dismissed every warning I gave about my ex's deceitful ways. He had ignored the truth, chosen to believe in her charm, and convinced himself that he knew better. Not only had he brushed aside my concerns, but he had gone so far as to marry her, completely disregarding the ethical and emotional betrayal it carried. Now he was sitting before me, ruined, drowning in debt, and begging me to save him. I kept my voice calm. You chose her over your own son's warnings. Now you're dealing with the consequences. I owe you nothing. His face contorted in anger, his voice rising in a furious outburst. He called me ungrateful, accused me of turning my back on family. And that was when I snapped. I laid it all out, the years I had suffered under her manipulation, the financial wreckage she had left behind when she drained my accounts, the humiliation I endured when my own father refused to believe me. Back then, he had blamed me for not leading her properly, as if her deceit was somehow my fault. Never once had he apologized for disregarding my pain. His anger melted into silence. His lips trembled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. In a broken whisper, he pleaded, "Please, just help me get out of debt." But I refused. I told him he needed to accept the consequences of his own choices. He had trusted a woman I had already exposed as a manipulator. He had ignored every red flag, convinced that he was immune to the same fate I had suffered. Now, his downfall was his own doing. Realizing I wasn't going to bend, he turned to the rest of the family, rallying support, twisting the story to make himself the victim. A cousin reached out, concerned, saying that my father had told them I was hoarding my money while letting him sink. I laid out the truth, the betrayal, the manipulation, the sheer audacity of my father's actions. When my cousin heard the full story, he was stunned. The truth spread quickly. Relatives who had once held my father in high regard were now speechless at his entitlement. He had married his own son's ex-wife, been scammed by her, lost everything, and was now demanding that I clean up his mess. It was absurd, and the more people learned about what had happened, the less sympathy he received. Enraged by my refusal, my father issued an ultimatum. "If you don't help me, I'll disown you." I met his gaze without flinching. "Go ahead," I said flatly. "You disowned me the moment you married her." The final confrontation came when he arrived at my door, his face twisted in desperation and anger. He demanded that I reconsider, claiming that families should stand together in times of crisis. I didn't hold back. "Family loyalty goes both ways," I shot back. "You showed me none when you married my ex and ignored how much it hurt me." I reminded him that he was reaping what he had sown. He had let greed and desire cloud his judgment, convinced that he was different, that he could control her. But she had played him just like she had played me. He accused me of seeking revenge. Maybe, in a way, I was. But more than anything, I was protecting myself. I refused to be the scapegoat again. His financial collapse was swift. With no money left, the bank finally seized his house. He had no choice but to move into a small apartment, trying to stretch the remnants of his dwindling retirement funds. Meanwhile, my ex had disappeared without a trace, likely in another state, conning someone else. Bitter and resentful, my father lashed out whenever he had the chance, telling anyone who would listen that I had abandoned him. But every time he tried to shift the blame onto me, I reminded him of the truth. He had made his choice. He had ignored my pain. He had sided with her. And now, he was paying the price. In a last, desperate attempt to recover his losses, he tried filing a lawsuit against my ex. But she had vanished, slipping away like a shadow in the night, leaving behind nothing but destruction. He would likely never see a cent of the money she stole. Eventually, he tried apologizing to me, but it was hollow, laced with self-pity and a clear expectation that I would still bail him out. I refused. The final blow came when he realized no one in the family was willing to bankroll his mistakes. He had burned too many bridges, and now he was alone. As for me, I moved on, a strange sense of closure settling in my chest. There was a certain poetic justice in watching karma play out so perfectly. The same woman who had torn my life apart had done the exact same thing to him. Some might say I should pity him, that I should help him. But where was his pity when I was drowning in debt, when I was humiliated and betrayed? He had taken her side without hesitation, called me controlling, and dismissed my suffering. Now, he was on his knees, asking for mercy. But I had none left to give. I had learned the hard way that enabling entitled behavior only leads to more abuse. I wasn't going to let myself be used again. And so, this chapter closed with finality. My father married my ex. She scammed him. She drained his money. She left him bankrupt. And now, he's struggling to survive, wanting me to be his savior. But I refuse. To anyone who asks, I tell them the truth. I lay out the full story, exposing how his own choices led him here. He may paint me as a bad son, but I know the truth. I am not heartless. I am simply done being a doormat. If he has learned anything from this ordeal, he hides it well. But as for me, I move forward with a grim satisfaction. Justice had been served.